Welcome back to Second Breakfast. We've got another fun game discussion today. I have just finished playing through Final Fantasy XVI. Maggie and I both played the demo for this game, and we were pretty bowled over by it. The presentation, the visuals, the graphics. I know I just said the same thing 3 times, but it really is maybe the most gorgeous, fully realized fantasy world I've ever seen on a screen.
Yeah, it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And that's like including like TV and movies. Like as much as I love the visual world of like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, like this was something else. So this is like what I want Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings to be, but they like won't quite go there because they're trying to be too grounded.
Exactly.
You know, like this was just like your ultimate like medieval fantasy dream in terms of visuals. It was so beautiful to look at.
And we've spent years talking about fantasy, whether it's Lord of the Rings, Witcher, Game of Thrones, well, all of these different worlds we've spent time in. And now that we're spreading more into games, there's a lot of incredible works of fantasy in that space. And Final Fantasy is one of the most perennial, meaningful, beloved series in that genre. So we wanted to talk about this new one and sort of, I don't know, give our take, because I have this idea about this game. My biggest takeaway is about heroic scale.
Awesome.
So I'm going to set the table a little bit, and then we can build to that idea.
Amazing.
So if you've never played a Final Fantasy game, what are these things? Final Fantasy XVI, which came out last year, 2023 now, is one of the biggest fantasy anythings of the year. If you talk about budget, if you talk about how much money it made, it is absolutely on a scale that's difficult to describe. It's the latest Final Fantasy game, as you can tell from 16, and the first one I've ever really played. I dabbled in some of the original ones.
Yeah, I've never even like touched a Final Fantasy game. I honestly didn't know like anything about it before we dove into this.
And Final Fantasy is an anthology series. So it's number 16, but it's an entry point. They're all sort of entry points. Some of them have spawned their own franchises. Final Fantasy VII has a couple different games associated with it.
Yeah.
So 16 is a new one, and it's sort of a shift for this franchise. It is a Japanese high fantasy series of games. The original bunch of them were turn-based. They're all role-playing games, heavy customization and party members. This one strips some of that back and sort of changes the play style to be more in line with things like God of War and Hogwarts Legacy and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, just to name the things we've done episodes on.
Yeah, like it's no longer turn-based or anything like that. I think that's why part of why we had never really jumped into the other Final Fantasy games, because we weren't really interested in turn-based stuff. I say that having also, like, currently I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm slowly introducing myself to the turn-based type of game, but like in the past it's not something I'd ever been interested in.
Yeah, you're dozens of hours into Baldur's Gate 3, so there's a lot of experience you have in that realm, but I've always been a little gun-shy about turn-based. So when I heard that this franchise was moving to third-person melee real-time combat like all those other games I just named, and seeing the aesthetic, I was very drawn in. And I played 35 hours of this. I beat the entire main quest and every side quest and all of the hidden monster hunts.
That's pretty amazing.
I really went to bat for this game.
I'll also share, the reason I haven't played this game beyond the demo is not because I was not interested. I was blown away by the demo, and that's what convinced me to buy it. I've just been not in a gaming mode lately. But
you've been doing Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, right. Like I kind of like was doing that when I did this demo. So I was like, I'll keep going with Baldur's Gate 3 and then I'll come back to this. And then I just like haven't been gaming like kind of since then. But I do want to play this, and like Cam's the previews I've gotten of his impression of this has really convinced me to dive back in. So, I mean, I think we bought the game for me, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Like, it was more like, this is going to be Maggie's kind of game, and then you just jumped in.
I started the demo, and I knew immediately this is a Maggie game.
Yeah,
But I also know sometimes it takes a while to convince you of things. And
yeah, that's just the way
it's hard to cross streams with fantasy. So if you're that deep in Baldur's Gate 3, I don't blame you for not picking up an entire other massive world to play in.
That's true, because we are also reading Game of Thrones. So
yeah,
there's
it's
that.
a lot. But the drama of this game, the operatic sweeping worlds, the imagery, the color, the magic.
Music is great.
Yeah, this was just so much fun. So the first point I want to play with, and this is sort of a throwback to the episodes we did on Path of Exile, if you've heard those, and that's another fantasy ARPG sort of game. I played Final Fantasy XVI the wrong way. And I did it in a different sort of wrong way than I did with Path of Exile.
Okay, what did you do that was wrong?
Well, I just prioritized what I wanted from the game instead of what the game wanted to do. And I used to feel bad about things like that, but, you know, we all die and some of us die early. So
seize the day.
what I wanted from this game was a pure fantasy sandbox. And from the first 10 minutes of even just playing the demo, you can very strongly sense the Game of Thrones influence.
Sure.
Clive Rothfield, who's your main character there, he is Jon Snow.
Sure, yeah.
He has a big direwolf with him. It's called Torgal, but it's just Ghost.
It's like if Jon Snow straightened his hair. That's what this is. If he went through like a My Chemical Romance phase in high school and straightened his hair, that's what this would be.
Some of us are still in that phase. But it has that level of palace intrigue and political backstabbing and like fun, gossipy geopolitics. It's very Game of Thrones. And I love that. I love the source material.
Of course, yeah. Who doesn't?
I love the books. I love the show. But I'm getting a lot of Game of Thrones right now because we're doing that close reading every Friday of a new chapter of Game of Thrones for the podcast. I've got a lot of that already in my brain. And I didn't know if I had room for a whole other similar cast in my head right now. And that was part of why I just sort of skipped over a lot of this, which means, and I feel bad about this part, I skipped over probably the most gorgeous cutscenes ever made.
And this is like a cutscene heavy game.
Right. And this is where I want to qualify it a little bit, because I was taken by some of the characters and storylines, and I sort of just tuned into those as much as I could and kind of tailored my own story. And again,
it's like you're skipping over some of the chapters of Game of Thrones. Like, I don't really care about Catelyn. I want to read about Tyrion.
I used to do this is one of my favorite stories. I used to do this with my mom when we would watch soap operas together. We got through 48 episodes of Young and the Restless in one weekend because we only cared about certain storylines. And if you just viciously edit it yourself,
like, who cares about this guy? I want to go back to this guy. I love that.
Yeah, so instead of feeling bad about it, I found it pretty liberating. The world really opened up for me. And as it opened up, it kind of blurred out in this beautiful way where I lost context for some things.
I was going to say, like, did you lose track of the story?
I mean, some of it. But I think that sort of shift is what I want to talk about. That change in perspective and comprehension. I found a really interesting new experience, but just to dwell on a point for one more second, the graphics in this game. I showed Maggie, so we're running cutscenes, not cutscenes, we're running screenshots in the background of this episode on YouTube. I would recommend checking out that version if you're on the podcast feed, just because the screenshots, oh my God, it's such a gorgeous game.
Beautiful images.
And what I mean when I call it pretty, it's the lighting engine.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
The fidelity of character design. It's the level of detail. It's the fog and the particle effects.
The architecture. It's so
seriously,
good. It's so good.
It might be the most impressive looking running game I've ever played.
It's pretty amazing.
Maybe Red Dead 2. I don't know. It's up there at least. And in the fantasy genre, absolutely. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, God of War is kind of up there. God of War looks pretty incredible, but it's hard to compare because God of War doesn't have those like stunning, gorgeous castles, you know, because we're just kind of in the wilderness, and then sometimes you're in these like more divine realms and stuff. But it's just different. But that's like the best comparison I can make.
God of War is a better game. It's more fun to play, and the story is, I mean, it's not fair, but I did tune into all of that story. But also that one is, I mean, check out our episode on that. That one was pretty personal for me.
Right.
But that is a game that is hard to match. But this one is arched high fantasy stuff that is very interested in the spectacle and majesty that the genre can reach.
Exactly. Yeah.
So for its priorities,
Different
I think
aims.
it's fairly incredible. Second thing I want to talk about here is that sense of heroic scale. And that's why I mentioned the screenshots, because I took all of these screenshots during the game. I mean, credit to the game, not me, but I'm trying to highlight this point in the images I chose here, because I was so constantly dazzled by the grandeur and majesty of this experience. The thing it most calls to mind is those sweeping Lord of the Rings shots. When a battle starts and the camera just spirals out and you get those dizzying, beautiful demonstrations of scale in real time.
Yeah.
the style of this game, the way the story is presented, is so much about scale, in that everything is so exaggerated. Everything is hyper expressive, hyper romantic, intense, and elevated.
Which I think is what fantasy is supposed to be, you know?
In a more classic sense, yes.
Like there's a certainly value to a really grounded fantasy story. I mean, that's why we love Game of Thrones so much. But when it does like reach those romantic heights, like that like tickles that little part of your brain, like the part of your brain that's still 8 years old and loves reading fantasy stories. Like that's what's so wonderful.
There's that idea about plays and theater performances of performing for the back row. And I kept being reminded of that idea because I was thinking of all of these elements that come together into this magical soup, and they're all going for broke. They're all blowing the doors off. Every boss fight, Maggie, I have never, ever seen boss fights this massive, this titanic and dramatic and insane. The settings, the variety of the world that you get to see here, the elemental abilities with all those particle effects and lightning and fire and water and earth. And it's not just like the 4 elements, it's all these other things too, but it is so cool and exciting. Every time slows down when you're doing a cool dodge, every massive weapon that you pick up, these just cool-ass swords you get constantly, your gear, all the enemy designs, the music, which you pointed out earlier, and the performances. I'm happy to report that Final Fantasy XVI is part of the Riku, which we've discussed before, the Ralph Ineson Cinematic Universe.
Oh, that's right.
Which does include Game of Thrones,
it does.
as well as The Witch and Diablo 4 and 100...
And the Green Knight and all kinds of things.
And he's briefly in Deathly Hallows. Remember?
Oh, that's right. Who does he play? He's
don't know.
He's like some Death Eater, I think, like some like, you know, B team Death Eater.
And of course, the original Office.
That's right.
He's in the UK Office.
I love that actor.
So yes, this is part of the Riku.
Awesome.
And he's fantastic as always, but with a voice that deep and dramatic, I think it serves this overall intensity.
I mean, he was born to be in fantasy stories because he feels so timeless and like, I don't know, magical almost.
And exaggerated. I think it serves the overall point here. The game is so often overwhelming in a good way, in a literally jaw-dropping way. I constantly found myself reaching for the screenshot button. Yeah. And I think that means something different because I've played a lot of games that are incredibly visually impressive or beautiful or striking, but they don't all make you reach for the screenshot button.
Right.
And I think it's those zoom out moments. Like when you're watching a movie that's not a Wes Anderson movie and you notice that something is symmetrical.
Yeah.
Like if there's 2 gunfighters in a Western and they're entering either side of the screen at like the same pace.
I'm just thinking of Barry Lyndon, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you notice that sort of symmetry, I feel like that's almost the same way I'm trying to talk about scale here.
You just have this moment of like, whoa.
Yes.
Yeah. And I had that feeling a lot while playing Hogwarts Legacy. I took so many screenshots in my first, like, I don't know, 10 hours of playing because I was so blown away by the beauty and scale of that world. And I can see how this is sort of that times 1,000, like minus the nostalgia that Hogwarts Legacy provides.
Yeah.
But like the scale and beauty of the landscape that you're getting to play in is so amazing.
There's a real sense of passion. You can tell that the developers, and I've watched some conferences with the developers, they just announced an expansion last week, and you can tell how much they love this world. The passion just kind of drips through everything they're talking about, but it's that sense of framing as well. I was reminded a little bit, to bring it to something kind of outside of our normal wheelhouse, I was reminded of Frank Frazetta. And those sort of paintings. We have, there's a little pizza place where we live that is just covered in Frank Frazetta paintings.
It's so fun.
We
It's
enjoy
so
all the little booths that have the different, grand heroic paintings that he did of all of these.
Like Conan the Barbarian and all that kind of thing.
Axes and dragons and girls and the whole thing.
Yeah.
And what I love about those paintings is that I almost never know the full context of what's happening.
Sure.
I don't know the characters. I don't know the backstory. But any of those paintings you look at, you get an impression. And that jolt of energy of the creation of it and how excited the artist feels
Right,
through just glancing at the work.
And then you feel excited. You're like, this is so cool. I want to be a part of this. Even if you don't know what's going on, you feel like, ooh, this is an amazing world I want to look at and spend time in.
It's infectious. And that's the sort of feeling that I had constantly through this experience, where I didn't, because of the way I played, I didn't know every character or every storyline, but I was so enthralled in this world. And I think because of the way I played this game, I preserved that sense of newness, which is so... I feel like that's part of the romance of the fantasy genre for me, is the magic inherent in that sense of discovery.
Yes, like finding new places and new like magical creatures and new worlds, yeah.
For example, I knew who Clive was. I knew who his brother was. I really liked that relationship. It's sort of the central relationship.
Yeah, that's what the prologue is, the demo is all about.
So I followed pretty much everything about them. But I didn't get to know everything about every new threat and boss that came their way. And what that meant is that all of those threats were kind of abstracted, where I was following an almost simpler version of this story, where our characters were heroes. And anything that came up against them were threats.
Yeah.
Like, and it was sort of binary.
And that's your like standard classic fantasy story. Like these are our heroes making their way through the world, fighting monsters and threats. Like that's all you need.
Yeah. And
all the other stuff is amazing and wonderful, but you don't need it.
Yes, I agree. And the side quests are all fairly simple. And it's it's my favorite kind of side quest, which is you being a good guy. I like that. I like clearing the list and all the check markers on the map of just being a good guy helping people.
Yeah, so like what were the side quests? Was it like go save this village, like go kill this monster?
Yeah,
like
some of that, clear out this thing, help this person, deliver this thing, follow up on this thing. There was a lady named Martha who was very pretty. There was a Martha's Rest, which was this sort of, it looked like an inn or kind of gathering place in this town, and I liked doing things for Martha. So I loved doing all of that stuff, and it almost made me feel like the protagonist in an old Western. It reminded me a bit of Red Dead with sort of less moral ambiguity, where I like being a good guy in games. Whenever I've played a game with like a morality system, you know, where you see that sliding scale of are you a good guy or a bad guy, I always max out the good guy side. I just like doing that.
Yeah, it feels right, especially when you're in a fantasy story. You want to be the hero. You want to be the chosen one, good guy.
When it is more classic and romantic.
Yes.
And maybe this is just a palate cleanser for me, for where I am in the middle of 2024. But Final Fantasy XVI I found to be a fantastically earnest work of fantasy, and a nice balance for all of the Game of Thrones and Dune that I'm mainlining right now between our other episodes, because I think I needed this in this moment. I needed that grandeur and majesty.
Yeah, not everything can be like, ooh, isn't the world so terrible? Isn't it full of so many terrible people?
And this is a world of constant terror and threats and loss and all of that too, but I think for the central characters to feel more classical and heroic and almost Arthurian in moments.
Yeah.
That's sort of what this game seems to be shooting for, that sense of heroic scale. And I think that scale and the scale of its heroism is present throughout these themes and even the emotions of the characters. You've got these set pieces and clashes that are incredibly emotional. There's always someone screaming.
Yeah.
The conflicts, the dramas, the victories, the losses, it reminded me a little bit of when I was a kid reading some like early manga from the library, like Dragon Ball Z kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Where yes, there were stakes and yes, there were magic systems, but when two characters were fighting, it was a lot of punching, there was a lot of screaming, and it was always just about like who was more mad. And who was more righteous. Okay. And even if at some point you kind of leave logic in the dust there's a way, if you believe hard enough, Tinkerbell will survive the play.
Yeah.
You know? Where someone can get more mad and more righteous and they turn into a bigger, scarier version of themselves, which is like an avatar for their purpose and their inner self.
Yes. That makes sense.
So you fight as this big kind of dragony fire beast sometimes in boss fights.
Is that in the demo?
Yeah, Ifrit. That's who you play as in the end. You play as a phoenix as well, but you see these kind of characters.
The phoenix. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there was always a moment where we would almost be losing. We'd be on the ropes in a big boss battle, and then we would get even more mad and even more righteous and find the strength within ourselves, and then we would prevail over the bad guys. And there's a silliness to that.
Yeah, right.
That I really enjoyed. Where characters can lose and lose and lose and always find some new way to power up and fight on. And there's something almost like inspirational in that.
Right,
And maybe it's because I've been, you guys have seen the Dune episodes. I've been deep in Arrakis.
Right.
And that is not a hopeful place.
No, not at all. Right.
Over time, 35 hours of seeing this type of storytelling and this heroism and this constant jaw-dropping scale, this exaggeration and style, the effect was cheesy and hopeful. And I think that's inherent to sort of the earnestness.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, refreshing, revitalizing type of fantasy that I very much needed right now.
Well, and it's tapping into, like, that's the kind of fantasy story you like as a kid. The stuff that is a little bit silly is kind of, is like unbelievable because it's so heightened, but it's like it's simplified of like it's just about being good and being able to come back from even the hardest, toughest fight because you believed in yourself, right? That feels silly as an adult, especially like if you're the kind of person like you and I who loves these like grim, dark, hopeless stories, and it's more grounded in reality and everything sucks and you can't be a hero and blah blah blah. But it is nice, you're right, it is nice to tap into that sometimes because it feels so connected to our childhoods and like the kind of stories that you like when you're a kid. And that just feels so comforting and can be hopeful in a way as an adult, even looking at the world that you're in now.
It almost has the feeling of a sports movie.
Yes,
like
all sports movies are the same,
but there's a reason that people love and cheer for them.
Yes.
If you look at something like Rocky, you follow it, it's fun, he almost loses and then he wins,
right?
It's exciting, it's sort of comfortable and familiar, that framework, but it does something for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, it feels like a lizard part of our brain. Like, you like that simple, like coming back from the worst thing and being stronger than ever, and
hero's journey,
and being good triumphing over evil. Like, humans love that, and it's
always have.
And it seems like this is tapping into that in such the perfect way, and that is so cool.
And the combat just feels so cool. You know, so if I'm a good guy and I'm being righteous and I'm fighting for my brother and the combat is just awesome.
You just feel cool.
The cool, like, phoenixy fire powers, and I'm kind of moving in slow-mo and cutting all these people up and all these big-ass monsters.
Right.
It was just a great time.
I love that. I only got to do a little bit of the combat, obviously, in the demo. The demo is like 2 hours long, but probably an hour and a half of that is just cutscene. I feel like. So I didn't get to do the combat very much. Did it feel like too easy and too overpowered? Like, were you just blazing through and like winning, or was there something of a challenge? Like, was it rewarding,
So I feel like I have evolved on the question of difficulty as I've gotten older.
Yeah.
And I talked about this a little bit in previous episodes. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but when I play God of War, when I'm Kratos, when I play Spider-Man and I'm Spider-Man, I want to feel powerful because one of them's a god and the other one's a superhero.
Sure. Yeah.
So I want that to feel powerful. I don't want to be cut down by every Draugr in God of War. And I've seen gameplay of that on the hardest difficulty.
Sure.
I have no interest in that at all.
Sure. I mean, to be fair, though, we've talked about this in our God of War episode. I couldn't do the combat in God of War. I found it too difficult. I have a totally different skill set than you do and all that. But like, I can imagine that getting the hang of the God of War combat and like figuring out all the best ways to combine skills and do stuff like is rewarding because there's still a bit of a challenge. So like, was it more like that for you in Final Fantasy?
So what I was building to there is that I think my opinion on difficulty is very much based on the style and tone of the game.
Okay. Yeah.
You know? So if a game is like Helldivers 2 is about grinding you into the dirt, and it's about friendly fire is turned on, and sometimes you just blow up and you get eaten by a bug or mowed down by these cool Terminators. So death is a part of that story. It's about just nameless, faceless
You're supposed to
soldiers
die a lot.
being thrown into the meat grinder. And there's an irony and humor to that when your friends blow you up by accident when you think they're right about to save the day, and you end up sort of chuckling at that.
Yeah.
So there's a different relationship with death and difficulty in that game.
Yeah.
This one, if I'm playing as if my version of Clive is this Arthurian classic righteous hero, I don't want to die.
Okay, yeah, that
So
makes sense.
I played it on an easier difficulty.
Yeah.
It also in your equipment slots, it gives you certain items because this is the first real-time game in the series. It was sort of an olive branch for players who were more comfortable in the turn-based previous games.
Oh,
It
okay.
gives you some of these items that make the combat system more approachable.
Okay, yeah, because the beauty of turn-based stuff is that everything is slow
Yeah.
and you have time to make decisions and to react and to think things through.
So it gives you options there where you can simplify the combat system all to one button, where you can have you can dodge automatically incoming attacks.
Sounds great.
You can heal automatically, so you don't have to watch your potions.
Yeah.
So I used some of those, and as I grew comfortable, I moved away from some of them. But
Yeah.
I found it challenging in a good way.
Yeah.
Like there are all of those legendary hunts that I talked about, of all those cool big-ass monsters who are hidden throughout the map. Those are ranked.
Got
So,
it.
some, like C, B, A, and S tier. So the S ones are really hard. There was one dragon that killed me like twice.
Oh, okay.
But besides that, I didn't really die.
Yeah. So it's like, I think, because the comparison I think of when I think about Final Fantasy in terms of like visuals is like Dark Souls, Elden Ring.
No.
And it's nothing like that.
No.
Okay, cool.
Also, you level. So if you go in at a normal level and you've done side quests, you're fine.
Cool.
So no, I was never frustrated. This
But also
is what
not
I
bored.
wanted it to be. No. Also, because the combat is so cool and flashy and you have all these awesome elemental powers.
You're just like excited to watch yourself be cool.
Yes.
It's not
you're
really
excited.
It's less about the challenge of beating the boss, and it's more about just I'm so excited to watch myself be cool in this fight.
The style and the flow state that you hit during combat and during boss fights, which can be pretty long.
Yeah.
And in multiple phases. I never found any of that boring.
Okay, amazing.
And some of that is the spectacle.
See, this is why I've been so frustrated about like thinking about Elden Ring and Dark Souls, because I know I will not like those games. Like I know that will just frustrate me.
Maybe.
But I've been so like upset by that because they look so cool. Like that's like it's the similar aesthetic, this like beautiful like gothic western medieval fantasy. Like that's like my favorite aesthetic. And so I've been so sad that I don't think I'll enjoy playing in those worlds because they'll just be too hard.
I think you're better at boss fights than I am. And that's where a lot of the difficulty comes from.
Yeah.
Because people say the first Dark Souls kind of game that you play is the hardest. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For me, it was Dark Souls 3, and that just kicked my ass. But even going to like simpler versions of that combat, and almost every third-person game is a simpler version of Dark Souls now.
Sure.
Whether it's Assassin's Creed Valhalla or the Star Wars Jedi games that I've been enjoying, they're all sort of based on that framework. Even this, it's not as much. Like there is a lock-on system and it's third person, but parrying isn't essential.
Okay. Yeah.
I think you are better at boss fights than I am.
Okay.
You're more patient than I am. And I think you could very much get into this style of combat where it's slower, it's more intentional. And I think your patience and investment in the world could pay off in a game like that. So
okay, yeah, maybe one day I'll try Elden Ring, and then if I get frustrated, I'll just jump to this and then have fun.
I think you should start with Dark Souls, because Elden Ring is incredibly open and mercurial in what the hell you're supposed to be doing.
Oh, I hate that. Okay.
So after you play something like Final Fantasy XVI, and now that you've played Hogwarts and these, more and more of these games in this third-person action ARPG sort of genre,
yeah,
I think you would do very well in Dark Souls.
Okay, maybe I'll give it a try. We'll see. We'll see. TBD. Keep an eye out for our Dark Souls episode.
Yeah,
maybe one day we'll do it.
We're doing more and more episodes about gaming. We've had a lot that have come out lately. We have Star Wars Jedi Survivor. We did Hogwarts Legacy. We did the first 2018 God of War. We did one on Halo Combat Evolved, which was really fun, revisiting an early Halo game.
For sure.
And we've got a lot more in the pipeline. Eventually, we're going to put together something for Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, I I'm just still playing it. It's a long game, folks. And also we've been doing an ongoing series on Diablo 4.
Oh yeah, long suffering.
If you're on YouTube, we've got a playlist of all of our game episodes, and we also have a separate Diablo 4 playlist because there are so many of those.
Path of Exile, Starfield, Fallout 3, that was a fun one.
Oh yeah. All and God of War, like you said, like we've covered a lot of games, and it's been really fun to dive into that world of these amazing stories that we like to talk about.
And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing Game of Thrones every single Friday. We're talking about a new chapter, doing an in-depth thoughts and theories discussion, going through the world of Westeros. And if you want even more content from us, you can go over to Patreon, $2 a month. You can support the show, get at least one bonus episode a month. We've been doing 2 lately, and we've been kind of ramping up with our offerings over there. You also get access to the entire back catalog of episodes we've piled up over the last 2 years over there in the vault. So thank you very much for listening, for supporting the show. Go check out Final Fantasy XVI. There's a demo.
Because they play the demo.
Nothing.
The demo is like so much fun. Yeah. It's so cool. And
this is a
there
delight.
are a lot of cutscenes, but like that's part of the game. But you could play like Cam and skip over that and just play the game.
And if you've been waiting for 10, 15 years for a great Game of Thrones game, if you squint at this, it's just Jon Snow and Ghost.
Exactly.
And you can run through the world with that.
Beautiful.
And he finally gets to fight, a Night King in this one.
Wow. Imagine that.
All right. We'll see you on Friday with a brand new episode. Thank you very much for listening.
Bye.